morning. Good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG, and today we're going to be speaking, I guess you'd say somewhat rhetorically. We are going to be talking about why we roleplay, and I'm doing this in a general way because the reality is, well, everybody roleplays. We may not recognize it as such, and so we will be describing it so that we can see the reality of it, and then from that we can perhaps analyze it a little bit. The concept of role-playing literally is taking on a role, a position in life that we don't normally carry, and we do this all the time. If we have an occupation that puts us in a retail position, once we are in the presence of the consumer, we have a very different personality and a different presence even than we do when we are, say, speaking with our friends or we're off the clock. The idea of taking on a role, therefore, is as natural and common to humanity as breathing. And this concept of roleplay, therefore, is not necessarily a game. It isn't necessarily something that we're doing for diversion. It's absolutely essential to our lives for us to be able to transition from one role to another role over time. And as we do this, we take on characteristics and personality quirks and such that basically help us sell the role to other people and to show them that we recognize our relative position in the world. But when I'm asking the question, why do we role play? In this case, of course, I'm referring to why do we do role play games? Why do we engage in fanciful, non-realistic role playing? And there are, I suppose, realistically, as many different reasons as there are different individuals. But today we're going to look at what are generally the avenues through which role playing occurs. And the reason why I want to mention these is that when you are role playing in a games group, different people play role playing games for different reasons. And once you can understand and recognize this differentiation, then you have the ability to perhaps reposition yourself in the role playing game to embrace or accept at least that other person's perspective on role playing, and therefore perhaps become more willing to accept the differences between you. One of the biggest reasons for role playing, to me, the monster reasons for role playing, is escapism. The life we have is limited with what we own, who our connections are, who our friends are, what possibilities we have in our futures. And so escapism gives us the opportunity to, at least for a time, be another person in another place with other options. And this concept of escapism can be as simple as I want to live in the country instead of living in the city, or I want to be brave instead of cowardly. I want to be something that I'm not. And escapism has its value, but when we are talking about in a role-play game, the reality is that if all the players are not in it for the same emphasis, or at least can't accept the other person's emphasis, then the very concept of playing together falls apart. So when we're looking at roleplay for escapism, we can also adjust our lens, so to speak, our perception, to embrace the others that are around us. In doing so, in somewhat limiting our own escapism to the general idea of escapism, we can therefore embrace other people in the same group and allow for those variations and not let them become stumbling blocks. Persons who role play for escapism often have well, I wouldn't say often, but may have issues in their life for which they need escape. They might have a troubled home life. They could have none. They could be perfectly fine, perfectly. So they just decide they want to be someone else and do something else than who they are, and all of those are. This is not a matter of judgment. This is just a matter of observation. The concept, therefore, of having an entire group who are escapist, you can pull some crazy shenanigans. You can be as divergent from the rules of our lives. I mean, you could have the laws of physics could be different. The laws of justice and fairness could be different. So the variety of escapist approaches can vary wildly. Normally, in a role-playing group, you'll have conforming views. In other words, where we agree that we're playing in a medieval setting or we're playing in a fantasy setting with these parameters as far as what equipment we might have, etc. But those numbers, those realities, those frameworks that you place on it, generally the escapist group or the escapist individuals aren't necessarily limiting in those areas, and so therefore the idea of balancing the escapism with the others that we're going to talk about is important. So it's really kind of the reason why most game masters will recommend a session 0 or a first game conversation is literally just this. You want to figure out where your player group is on this spectrum of possible reasons to roleplay, and then try to figure out where the common ground or the commonalities can be to allow the group to work together. I've had groups where one player is bound and determined to become a specific person in terms of they've got the other ideas in mind and they're trying to pursue those goals, while accepting the fact that some of the players are literally there just to escape from their humdrum. And so therefore it creates interesting dynamics within the groups. So the session zeros are really essential for dividing these out. And I know that I'm kind of all over the board because I'm bouncing around, but escapism as the initial one of these is a large part of why we roleplay. But generally in that escapism, we can choose for ourselves limitations. So, for example, I want to escape from this world, but the storyteller, game master, is going to be wanting to tell a story of the world of Tolkien or the world of Terry Brooks or perhaps their own creation. My willingness to participate in their worldview, therefore, is the way that we temper those escapist thought processes and keep them in line with what's going on in the story. Escapism is particularly powerful for an untrained mind, someone who hasn't done a lot of imaginative roleplay. Tends to go a little hog wild. They want to see what the boundaries are, and so we'll go into other ways that escapism manifests. But I just wanted to clarify that the escapism point is really generally what most people are role-playing to do, is get out of the world that they're in. The next one I want to mention is elevation. Many of us have nowhere jobs in a nowhere career on a nowhere path. In other words, we didn't think about where we were going to end up as we lived our lives. We simply processed the actions and the events that were around us and defined them for ourselves. And therefore the idea of being able to elevate oneself to become more becomes really important. And this elevation process is built into most role-play games. There's generally a path of advancement because it's gone beyond just escapism. It's now, okay, if I'm outside of this framework, what can I do to advance myself? What can I do to become greater than I am? And perhaps it's part of escapism to be considering your elevation in culture, or elevation in income, elevation in activities. But to some people, their framework is such that the world they're in is static, and this is roleplay is a great way to feel that level of progression or advancement. We all, I mean, it's attractive to think about our lives meaning something in real terms, and although it is true, most of us don't consider it because we see that the path we're on isn't getting us the advancement we'd like, or we're not progressing as quickly as we would like, and therefore having a world where that advancement is much more visceral, much more visible and accessible is really kind of important to the actual process of play. We want to get better, we want to get smarter, we want to get faster, and so on. For others, it's merely what are the limitations. If you're stepping into a fantasy realm, there is the curiosity of what happens if I push the big red button. You know, I've been told don't do this, but don't push the button, don't run risks, don't take challenges, don't step out on a limb. But being able to evaluate the world through a different set of eyes is rather intoxicating as well. So while these are all somewhat tied together, the idea of evaluating an action for its goodness, badness, value are all, I guess you'd say, part of the process of advancement and curiosity and escapism. But the idea of evaluating, literally looking at what pieces are moving and why they move and how we can adjust them or moderate them is an important aspect of role play. This evaluation process, if the game is being moderated by a game master who is very strict in terms of the definitions of rules as written, you're actually evaluating the very process by which one lives. And that can be useful in terms of the elevation of a persona. If you learn that the game master rewards the death of monsters more so than he does the communication and avoidance thereof, then you learn that the best way to advance is to, murder things. And that process of evaluation does change the way you perceive of interactions later. So if you are in a games group where the game master is absolutely providing earned experience points to a greater extent by the number of creatures that you kill, well, you're going to kill more monsters. You're going to want to physically engage rather than intellectually engage with the monsters and the villains in the story. And that evaluation process goes on, the game master reading the players as much as the players are reading the game masters. And that evaluation leads to arguably better play within the framework, but the framework itself may be adapted. And so, to me, the extension of that is eventually you get to the point of exploration. How do we find out what parameters will trigger a storyteller's reaction? What things can we do in the game that are going to modify the way of interaction with the creatures and beings that we have? So we're going to explore those. And that exploration can be as open-ended and curious as what's in the next room. I mean, that's an obviously mechanistic way to do it. Just simply say, exploration is a understanding of the length, width, height, rate of gravity reaction to stimulus mechanism. But it can even be an exploration of the persona. What are the temptations that the persona is running into? What things happen in the world that cause the player character to react the way it does? So exploration can be intrinsic as well as extrinsic. You can be looking at how to modify the world, but you also might be looking at ways to adjust your own advancement process. all of this leads to the idea that in general, why do we role play? We like to experiment. We like to consider other options. When we were children, we would role play in order to consider the relative benefit and cost of different actions. If we were a firefighter, what kind of things would we have to think about in a burning fire? What considerations would we have to take into account? Now, generally, we're doing it in a much more protected environment, so the idea of being in a fire is now, and if I'm triggering somebody, I apologize, but the idea of putting ourselves in those dangerous places is a way for our brains to process all the possibilities we might have if we are subjected to at least some of those stimuli. And that process is what helps us develop as human beings in terms of how do we interact with each other. What do we do when we are conflicted? What do we do when we actually feel anger and frustration? What do we do when the world doesn't line up with what we want? And role-playing, the play part of it, comes from the joy, the understanding that we develop as we engage with each other, as we are able to observe the very mechanism of our communication in almost a third-party kind of way. We're stepping outside of ourselves to step into a different role and consider what kinds of thought processes that other position might create. And when we do this, we give ourselves new variables and ultimately a wider array of role-playing options, a wider array of class abilities. I use the word class here only because it's been ingrained into our culture to think that that's the way it works. But the reality is that to think about things as, for example, might be if you were of an eldrin species where you have a 300-year lifespan and you've been doing this so long that it's now rote memory to you. So how much of that is really advancement and how much of that is just busy work? And if it is busy work, what does that feel like? And what do we do with all of these different possibilities or options? It really lends itself to a realization that we role play mainly because we're human beings. We have, as our very being, the idea of an adaptation and consideration of options and decision-making processes, and all of those are better served with a larger pool of potential options. And so why do we role play? We role play because we're human. It's part of who we are. It's part of what we are. And in some ways, that's precisely why the very concept of creative imagination is essential to our advancement, and why in many ways it feels like our culture is sort of stuck, is that we have pigeonholed and put away the creative aspect of our imagination. We have forced ourselves to become imitative, drawing in data through videos and cartoons and video games and such that tell us what options we have. And in reality, we have far many more than what those that are being fed to us, so to speak. And so why should we role play? We should role play because it gives us this larger arsenal of concepts and ways to react to situations, and therefore become more adaptable and more creative as we go along. Man, this video didn't take me near as long to get through as I had imagined, but the reality is that whether you are role playing to just escape from the world you're in, whether you are doing so that you can perceive the elevation and advancement that you want in your life but you aren't getting otherwise, whether you are trying to evaluate the way in which you interact and looking for new options, or whether you're just merely exploring the world of the storyteller, these all are fundamentally the curiosity factor of humanity manifesting through experimentation. So I would ask you this question. It's simple. When was the last time you roleplayed? When was the last time you pitched yourself into an environment of which you are not familiar, and then considered what options you might have in that case? And I would recommend that if you haven't in the recent time, you might want to consider joining us in the game sessions we hold at Board Games Paradise, or those that we run online. If you like this video so far, make sure you follow this channel here on Twitch, and of course check out our videos over at YouTube. And if you can, join our community over at Patreon. We'd love to have you included and become a part of the world of Nykos. There's so much more to explore and so much more that I could reveal, but it's not in context. So I'm going to leave this at this point. The question asked and answered in this case is, why do we roleplay? We roleplay so that we can become more than we are by giving ourselves wider arrays of options of how to interact with one another. This has been Creative Differences. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been NycosRPG, and we'll see you next time.